please join me in welcoming Christoph onto the stage.
Well, I'd like to mention to the INSNA board that in a couple of years, when Johan will receive the similar award, I totally volunteer to give an introduction. Okay, here we go. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for everyone who's on Zoom. So it's great to be here and give this presentation. I'm going to talk, as Johan already said, about the dynamics of social networks, and the subtitle is maybe a bit more boring than the one that you suggested. So I'm looking into the question how social ties emerge, how networks form, how networks change through time, and also how networks affect individuals that are embedded in those networks, so how they impact our lives. And well, when I teach social networks, I usually start just showing a couple of network plots. That's what I'm going to do here as well, even though I don't have to teach anything to you guys here. This is a network that was collected by a collaborator, so Sandy Pentland. So there are no peripheral nodes in this one, or peripheral ones. But you can see that this is a network of people, young adults who have recently moved to a new university, and they live in the same housing project, and they all move together with their partner. So you see these red dotted lines, that's partnership relationships, romantic partnerships or marriages. And those people don't come from far away. They don't know people there yet, but then they start forming friendship relations. That are these blue ties that you see in the network. And it's quite an interesting setting because these people are highly educated. Many of them say they have no prejudices, they have no preferences for homophilous ties, and yet we end up with a network which is somewhat clustered. And if you look at these clusters A, B, C, and D, those mostly follow ethnic demographic attributes. So you have a cluster of Asian people, you have a cluster of white Americans, you have a cluster of Hispanics, you have a cluster of Middle Eastern people. And it's quite interesting how people who seem to express no preferences for homophily yet end up in this relatively well-structured social environment. And one reason how we can think about network dynamics, emerging social networks, that these are, of course, complex systems. And of course, we can think of networks that are much larger than this one. But in the end, what explains how they change are individuals' actions and preferences and behaviors. So we can very well understand social network dynamics by zooming in on individuals and trying to understand what are their preferences, what are their motivations, how do they find the people they connect to. And however, when many people follow these individual processes, we may end up with a network that has certain features like this one, which is kind of segregated by ethnicity. And those outcomes, network level outcomes, they constitute some kind of a reality that matters for people. If you think about there's a new couple moving into this housing community, it is already quite difficult to develop social network, friendship relations with a diverse set of people, or that would mean that you're kind of in between clusters. So it's much easier already to embed yourself into one of those existing clusters, in particular if you think that many people meet others through their existing contexts, so like transitivity. So there are these different levels of social networks, the individual level, the network level, and those are not independent and they kind of co-evolve. So this is a very famous network collected by Behrman, Moody, Stovall. So this is from the famous Chains of Affection paper. And again, this is a network which is about romantic and sexual relationships between high school students. And this clearly also follows some preferences. People choose partners, people kind of establish relationships through some kind of an agreement process. But in the end, you have a network that has certain structures like this weird ring that might be completely meaningless. That is, however, well, it's pretty clear that the people in this network will have no idea how the network looks overall. But some of these features, maybe not the ring, but some of those features of the network will have an effect on individuals as well. So it matters whether you have 3 sexual partners in the periphery of a network versus when you are in the center of the network. If you think about, for example, is this network as a potential one, or similar networks that serve as a conduit for the spread of STDs. So it matters where people end up in their networks, also for some individual outcomes. And well, this is from another study that we did. And here the question was in how far the positions that people end up in the network, whether this might be associated with some individual outcomes such as academic success. So these are university students. They form social relationships with people they don't know. And where we did this visualization, where the more shiny someone is, the better they were doing in a final big exam. And the question was whether the position then you end up in might affect some individual outcomes such as success. So these were 3 examples about social network dynamics, but also about the relationship between individual outcomes and network outcomes. So we can think of this as with this Coleman type of model, or in other ways, but there's the network level where you see how networks are maybe emerging from something empty, or how an existing network changes through time. And we can think about that these changes are mostly explained by something that is happening on the lower level, on this individual level. So people have certain preferences with whom they kind of, which explain how they try to form ties, relationships with others. And many people forming ties with others, changing their relationships, interdependent actions explain how the network changes. But then, of course, it's not just a matter of preferences, but there are some differences in opportunities. There are some constraints that people face. If you, for example, have a network that is highly clustered, this already constrains the way you can easily form ties. For example, building out group ties can be very difficult if you think about mechanisms that relate to structural balance, for example. So we have to consider preferences, opportunities, constraints if we want to think about network dynamics. And fortunately, there's a lot of theoretical work that we can draw upon to look at different parts of this Coleman type of explanation. So if we want to answer the question, why do individuals form social ties? Under what circumstances do they form social ties? Well, we can look into this very generic explanations. So what actually do people strive for with their network choices? So they strive for increasing their level of safety. Maybe as a competing goal, they strive for increasing their level of effectiveness. They want to have networks that are kind of, on the one hand, cognitively easy to process, but also at the same time don't induce stress through being in weird, imbalanced social situations. There's this general idea about networks being part of your social capital. Networks are something that you form your identities with. You build identities as a group. And at the same time, there are some kind of obvious limitations, how many ties people can have, because it's cognitively difficult, costly, and also time-wise potentially costly to have many social relationships. So these are kind of theoretical explanations why people would form certain ties and avoid forming certain other ties. And what we often do, what we can do in network research is that we often don't observe those directly, but we observe changing networks, and we can try to do a mapping from those theoretical explanations to something like a network mechanism. This is, however, not a one-on-one mapping. So this is already where we're losing this the immediate causal interpretation in our research. So, for example, transitivity, the tendency to connect to people that someone is indirectly tied to, that can be both explained by safety, for example, but also cognitive balance, potentially also some kind of social identity explanation. So there is not a one-on-one mapping, but you can link certain types of theoretical explanations to some network mechanisms. So, and if we think about statistical models, we often throw in a number of effects, but important is to think about how those relate to these underlying theoretical causal explanations. If we look at the other type of link, so how are and why are individuals by affected their network positions? Again, there's a lot of literature from sociology, social psychology, economics, and so on that we can draw upon. So the differences in network positions can relate to differences in access to social support, to subjective well-being, to mental and physical health, to competitive advantage, brokerage, success in different domains of life. Social influence is something that depends on network positions relative to one another. And finally, there's also this the idea of that certain constraints may exist in a network position. So this example that I kept coming back to, people being clustered in different groups and having the difficulty to connect, to bridge ties over group boundaries. This is an example of how outgroup boundaries may matter. Propinquity, as in the work of Festinger et al., like the chance of randomly bump into people. All these things can affect how people are individually affected by their social network position. And again, of course, we can use network descriptives, many of which are discussed here and have been developed further to think about these network positions. And people have been doing this in a lot more sophisticated way. But again, we can do a mapping between those network positions and some kind of a measurement, not a one-on-one mapping, but some mapping we can do between network descriptions of positions and these individual outcomes. And well, I'm doing a lot of empirical research these days, and of course, I started off, as Johan nicely described, in my PhD working on statistical models, relational event models. So this is in a sense is one part of this empirical research chain that we are trying to use. There's some theoretical background which helps you find some interesting research questions. People collect data, they model these data, they generate some results with which they in turn learn something about their research questions again, and hopefully improve their knowledge about social theories. And I'm going to talk about two examples of two research lines that I've been working on. The first one would be the question of building models and software. So I'm going to talk about dynamic network actor models. And the second part is the question of how we can run empirical studies, how we can collect data, analyze data, and I will talk a little bit about the Swiss student life study that we have conducted over the past couple of years at my research group. In the statistical part of my talk, so I have been working for quite some years with relational event data. So these are timestamp data. If you have a network like the red network, in this visualization, this is a network of social media events, people connecting to one another on Facebook. I'm sure many of you have larger and more exciting data sets than this one. So this is more like a technical demonstration. But if we have sequences of how people connect to others on social media platforms, or how they communicate through digital tools, how countries form treaties with one another, we often have this timestamp data format and can learn something about the underlying network mechanisms that best explain certain levels of dynamics. And something similar we can do with data that were collected through surveys. So like friendship data, where you have a snapshot at one point in time and maybe a snapshot a year later, you still can assume that there is some kind of a sequence how you got from one network to the other network, and try to understand these dynamics with the help of network mechanisms. And one framework that a lot of the modeling efforts are built upon is the work of Tom Snyder's stochastic actor-oriented models, where you think about a tie or an event to come about as a two-step process. One part is explaining individual rates. Who are the people who are most likely to make changes to their network? Would be the first question that we answer. And the second question is, if people make changes to their network, with whom do they create ties, with whom do they dissolve ties? And there's this nice mathematical framework where we can think of this as a Markov process that helps us to answer questions both on the individual levels. For example, are extroverts more likely to send events, or are extroverts more likely to form friendship ties with other people? Are central individuals networks more stable? So So thinking both about individual attributes and network positions. And in the second part, we can ask questions about with whom do people form relationships. So are ties to similar others more likely? Is a tie more likely to appear when it's embedded in a clique structure, or maybe something that goes across different measurement levels? So whether are people more likely to perceive each other as close if they are exposed to someone's social media feeds? That could be something that goes across this perception event level. And in each of those cases, or survey data like friendship data, we can think of these as Siena models, or relational event data, we can estimate similar network mechanisms with just different approaches. One is a very, very straightforward direct maximum likelihood estimation, whereas with panel data, we have the problem that we have this unobserved sequences, how we got from one observation to the other one, that we have to treat or can treat as missing data, and then use some missing data techniques. So some of which have been developed by Johan and colleagues to kind of infer likely paths connecting different observations. Anyways, let me just jump to some example results. So what you see on the right-hand side of this slide is the results of a relational event model. So it's a partially specified relational event model. And you see that in this specific example, which is a community of students who got to know each other recently, start forming friendship ties, start forming ties on Facebook, that there are mechanisms, that there's evidence for mechanisms like transitivity on the right-hand side. So people tend to form clusters within their social media networks. There's also evidence that people have homophilous preferences in terms of their study major, but they have heterophilous preferences in terms of gender. So they rather connect to the opposite gender on these platforms. And on the left-hand side, you can think of this as something kind of a Siena model, which explains how perceived friendship networks change through time. And also there you can test similar mechanisms. You, for example, see that people are more likely to create ties that are embedded in transitive structure, and they're less likely to dissolve them. They're more likely to create reciprocal ties and less likely to dissolve them. They're more likely to create ties to others who have a similar study background, but the study background doesn't matter in these models for the dissolution of ties. So there's no significant negative effect here. So this is the way how we can use statistical models to link data to certain network mechanisms and then try to interpret those. And one thing that we're working on is combining those two sides. So basically not treating those two, the Facebook dynamics, the friendship dynamics, as two separate models, but think about how we can couple them, how one network can inform the other. And indeed, there is evidence in this example for things like that the model is informed, the friendship model is informed by social media connections and vice versa. So we can jointly interpret these type of models. But in principle, these are all actor-oriented models, as in the way that were brought forward by Tom Snyders and colleagues. So we do develop software, and if you're interested in this, in our package, the Goldfish package, there's another workshop already at the European Social Networks Conference very soon. So if you want to learn more, this is open source software and it's available on GitHub, and we are happy for anyone who's using it and also anyone who's kind of using the discussion forum, bringing up issues so that we can kind of have a more guided further development of this package. So that was a short overview of some of the more methodological work that we have been working on, that I've been working on during my PhD, but that we are now working on as a group and also with lots of collaborators outside of the group. And the second bigger line of research that I've been doing over the past years are empirical studies in collaboration with others, so using other people's data, but then also increasingly by collecting data in specific settings. And one focus over the past year were networks in educational settings. And this is, well, one study that we ran, which was the biggest effort study that I ever did, was the Swiss Student Life study, where we were interested in how social networks come about in a community of first-year undergraduate students at a Swiss institution. So how do people who come to universities rarely know anyone at the beginning. How do these people start forming ties with one another? And how do these emerging social networks then relate to a number of individual outcomes? And specifically, we looked into well-being, mental health, motivation, and academic success. So the backbone of this study is actually very traditional survey data collection. So we had quite a number of waves over 3 years. We had 13 waves of network data that we collected through surveys, and we didn't just focus on 1, 2, 3 dimensions, but overall in different surveys we have like 30 different relational dimensions that were collected. Some automatically through surveys, but there are different many dimensions of relationships that we try to collect. And we also try to combine different data collection tools. I said survey data is the backbone, but we also used some social sensor data at specific events to try to understand how people interact in a given setting. We collected some social media data. I showed you some of the Facebook data that we collected back in the days when the APIs were still accessible. So we did some short surveys where we sent 3-minute surveys on the phone of participants. And also we did some network experiments, and I will have a very short example at the very end of my talk, how we do some kind of quasi-experimental research in network settings. So overall, in this Swiss Student Life study, we have 3 cohorts of first-year undergraduate students with about 1,000 people. And there's this very nice special issue in social networks, and with András Vörös as the first author, we summarize the data collection in some detail. So what we try to do is that we started collecting data as early as possible. So basically in September 2016, students arrived at the university on a Monday, and on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we already invited them to computer labs to collect data, network data, but also individual data, demographic data. And indeed, after a couple of days of being together, there are already some reported social relationships. People have, in light blue, pleasant interactions with one another. In darker blue, this is friendship relations, and in purple, even though they haven't really properly started yet, some people already report that they're collaborating with others in their studies, so that they're doing homework together, that they're preparing for the exam together. However, the network is still pretty sparse, and we repeatedly collected data. So this is already the 3rd wave after 3 months. So here we have already a quite dense network, with which, from a structural point of view, if you look at the network after 8 months, doesn't really change so much. So it's the level of the density, the level of clustering, everything is relatively stable on a stable level. However, there's still a lot of change going on. So new ties are being created through times, old ties are being dropped. So this network is a dynamically changing thing, and people reorganize their social lives within this community constantly. Well, we have all those network dimensions, and one obvious question that we looked into is, well, what is first of all the overlap? And there are these 3 networks that I've just shown: pleasant interaction, friendship, studying, and the latter 2 are, it appears, almost fully embedded in pleasant interaction, but they're not completely overlapping, but still 80% of people who study together, so that would be this purple bubble here, are also report that they're friends with one another. 20% don't report to be friends with one another. So the first question we asked, or one of the first questions, is how do these networks actually jointly evolve? And here we're using the kind of Siena stochastic actor-oriented model approach that I mentioned earlier, to understand how the co-evolution between the friendship and the studying network happens. And this is an example of 4 parameters in a Siena model. There are many more, of course, so these are the key parameters. And what we see here is that it appears that it's more common that people form friendship ties first and then become study partners with the same people. So it's 50 times more likely than non-friends becoming study partners. And there's somewhat less evidence and also a much weaker effect for study partners to become friends. So this is only 4 times more likely than non-study partners becoming friends. Also, it's a non-significant effect. So it appears that in the evolution of the network, it's that people first form these informal relationships. They meet others maybe at student parties, at some informal settings, and later when it's get more crucial, when more homework has to be done, these are the people they also choose as a study partner, as someone to collaborate with. Also interesting is that people who report multiple relationships at the same time, that means that each of those is more stable than if you have just a single dimensional tie to someone else. We try to link those networks to some individual outcomes, and most importantly, in this setting, this was academic success. So one thing that is specific about the study programs that we're looking into is that these are highly competitive. These are among the best in at least in Switzerland, probably in Europe. So it's very valuable to get a degree in these programs. However, and at the same time, admission is open. So you don't even have to do a test to get into those programs. If you have a high school degree, which by itself is already quite selective from a Swiss high school, you can just enroll into those study programs. However, after 1 year of studying, there is some kind of a delayed entrance test. So, and typically, even though there's a high level of self-selection, even though people are pretty qualified and know that it's going to be hard, only about 2/3 manage to pass this delayed entrance exam, which happens at the end of the year. And indeed, in this year and in this specific sub-cohort that I'm looking into, there were 163 people of those who initially enrolled, that's only 72%, signed up for this final exam. The others delayed it by a year or had dropped out by the time already. And of those 163 people, only about 2/3 passed and 55 failed. So this is now an individual outcome, and we try to associate this with the network positions of individuals. Of course, we can first do this more descriptively. So this is again the network that we collected after 8 months. So that is like 2.5 months before this big exam that students had to take. And you see in purple, this is now the collaboration ties, and dark blue is friendship, light blue is pleasant interaction. And if we just visualize the nodes that passed the exam and their incoming ties, so whether they were reported as a pleasant interaction partner, study partner, or friend by others, then it appears that the network almost looks identical. Well, it's somewhat sparser, but if we look at the network of those people who failed, we can see that these networks for sure are much sparser. And of course, these are different sets, different sizes of subsets. But indeed, if we look at the average degrees, people who were successful also had more ties. Of course, this doesn't answer any causal link. However, what we did as a next step, and I leave the details for you to read up if you're interested in, is using network autocorrelation models to see in how far network position was associated with these academic outcomes in a multivariate model, where we could then also control for things like prior academic achievement, demographics, study efforts, so how many hours they would put into studying, being perceived as clever by others. And if we do this in a multivariate model, there's still a significant association between being embedded in a network and being more successful. And the effect size is actually quite impressive. So it appears that there is some important relation that we should understand in more detail between social embeddedness and academic success of those students. Well, so then we had collected data for 3 years, a bit more than 3 years, and the data collection was supposed to end in late 2019. So we were in Zurich sitting on a big pile of data, started analyzing, running our first studies. We had pre-registered some things. And I think in September 2019, we had our final data collection, and I was actually completely relieved that finally there would be no more risks that are associated with data collection, like data breaches, kind of students, participants being unhappy about data collection. So I was happy this was over. But then, of course, we know in March 2020, COVID hit, and we decided hesitantly to write an ethics amendment and collect some more waves of data. Hesitantly because of all the risks, but of course excited to learn more about what was going on. So the next data collection was in April 2020. This was during the first lockdown in Switzerland. And this is just one of the networks. This is physical meetings. With whom did you have physical contact? Did you have physical contact recently? And you see that this is a very sparse network. It's mostly ties that are being reported are of flatmates, because university was fully locked down, everything was online, and as you have experienced, most of public life was frozen. There were some interesting things. So these people had known each other for quite a few years already. So this is people who had been studying together for 2 years, and of course their social relations didn't disappear. So they still reported friendships, pleasant interactions, study partners, and so on. And of course, they maintained those relationships through digital communication tools. So there was still a lot of interaction going on using messaging, calls, social media. So this network actually stayed well connected. However, once we looked into some more details, what we saw is that the average degrees decreased. So they interacted and collaborated less with less people on average than before. And maybe what was a bit more troublesome was that almost twice as many students were studying by themselves. When they before were studying in groups, now they were sitting at home and studying by themselves. And I think one of the things that we started to understand from this previous study is how important it is to have study partners, people to work with. So first of all, it might be much easier to study or to explain things to one another. Also, there's this role of motivation, of mental health. All of this is directly linked to being connected with others and having someone to work with. We also had collected some information about mental health, and it appeared that all mental health trajectories were going in a negative way. So depressive symptoms, anxiety, stress, loneliness, all these aspects got worse. And well, of course, this is a very descriptive study, so there's no statistical model up to this point at all. And in a sense, none of this is really surprising. If you lock people at home, sure, they will have less interaction. Sure, they will feel worse. But of course, it got us and university management thinking about the students who would arrive the next year, because obviously, at least those students could rely on some established ties that they had been building for 2 years, and they could, in a meaningful way, use whatever WhatsApp or other social media platforms to stay in touch and maybe even to collaborate online. But what happened to students if you hadn't met anyone yet in person? And specific to this study program is many people hadn't known each other beforehand. So they come from many different places, and most of the social relationships we observe, they only start developing once students actually arrive at university. And what our university management, and this is now data from our own university, what they did is that students were assigned to COVID bubbles based on the insights of our studies and many other studies. And the idea was that if there was and I think many universities around the world did it that way. So you would physically meet some of the people in class. So for example, you would have on-site lectures. This is an engineering program, so you would have on-site practicals. But if you are on campus, you would only physically be in the same room with the people within your bubble, which is about 20, 21 people. So it was supposed to be large enough so that people have some social context to choose from, but small enough so that this wouldn't disrupt university too much if a whole bubble had to isolate, which was the case if there was one positive test within the bubble. There was also one specific consideration here, which is that there's two very small minority groups, or relatively small minority groups. This is an engineering program which has only a very small percentage of female students, and it's also a German-speaking program, so there's also a small percentage of foreign students who come from a different language background. And it was made sure that these minority groups would be overrepresented in some of the bubbles. So there are a couple of bubbles where 50% of the members were from either of the two minority groups. So what happened over the years? So this was autumn 2020, and then we collected data again in autumn 2021. And during that year, well, the lockdown ended, and the spring semester in February 2021 already started with on-site teaching. So there were lots of opportunities finally to physically meet the people who you had potentially only met online so far. And well, this is not a very sophisticated plot. The colors refer to the bubbles, and you can see it's very hard to tell whether there are any bubble ties. So I highlighted those for you here. And so this is a friendship network which is pretty dense. So people had on average about 3 friends reported. It's nicely structured like many friendship networks that we observe in empirical settings. And yet after 1 year and 8 months of not being under lockdown anymore, still 45% of all friendship ties were between bubble mates. And if you think about what you would randomly expect if bubbles and friendship were not related at all, you would expect like a 4% overlap. So this is quite a significant and strong effect that we still observe here. And it appears that these bubbles were the most important context in which students form social ties. And of course, it's not only a context, but also these bubbles are an important constraint because you could not easily meet people from a different bubble. And well, I was asked to mostly talk about old work, and this is something very, very recent and ongoing. But I thought that there's actually a nice and interesting link between this study of how these designed bubbles relate to social network formation with a special theme of the conference. Because if you think about environmental disasters that may lead to displacement, that may lead to communities having to be rebuilt, maybe elsewhere, often there are policymakers like the ones at our university who define how people meet one another. And these designed network interventions about who has easily contact to whom and for whom is there like a bigger constraint to get in touch, those seem to be quite powerful. And we can, of course, think about them in a way that we may use them like it was done in this study to make sure that some existing level of network segregation, like segregation between majorities and minorities, is not further amplified, or some policymakers may want to think the other way around, that you kind of want to increase homogeneity in order to facilitate communication, or maybe social support networks within those designed networks. So this is some ongoing work, and this is what I referred to earlier as a network experiment, because this is a true randomization, and we have like our treatment group in a sense. It's a quasi experiment, are pairs of people who were assigned to the same bubble, whereas the control group are pairs of people who were assigned to different bubbles. So to slowly start wrapping up. So this is the Coleman visualization, Coleman graph that I showed at the beginning, how we can think about network emergence, how network changes, how large scale changes, network level changes can often be well explained on the individual level by thinking about network mechanisms and how they operate based on our theoretical assumptions. What is important is also to think about how the network itself can actually facilitate, create opportunities, but also create constraints. So people will end up in different individual positions, and those positions will have an effect on how they are able to create ties with others. Think about the group example earlier, think about examples of differences in degrees in being isolated versus non-isolated. And sometimes we have structural constraints that can be constraints like the bubbles that were designed, or it can be constraints that are, for example, spatial constraints that have an effect on how people can actually express their preferences in a meaningful way. And all this together is this individual path that we can try to better understand, to get a deeper understanding how networks emerge and how they change over time. And if we understand better how people end up in certain network positions, we can also try to link this to a number of individual outcomes, as it has been done in this community for many years, thinking about motivation, identification, attitudes, well-being, mental health, and success, as in the empirical examples that I talked about. Okay, with this, I'd like to come to an end. There's just one more thing that I wanted to say. I mean, obviously, the reason for this talk is a personal award, and we're network researchers, so we should be naturally critical about any such thing, because we know we have very little or nothing without our social networks. So I'd like to say, as a final thing, a big thank you to the people in my professional network who have been supporting me. So the people who have been mentors, I was lucky to have as mentors, people I was lucky to have as collaborators, people I was lucky that they trusted me enough to join my team. And then finally, the INSNA community as a whole. I think this is a fantastic professional setting with people being extremely supportive, curious, full of good ideas. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this. So thank you all, and thank you for attending the talk.
Thank you, Christoph. That was, I think, yeah, that was actually well, not actually, that was a really, really exciting talk and body of work. And yeah, perfectly illustrates the point of pushing the envelope in network research, but doing it in the search of substantively meaningful questions. Thought it was excellent. So I think I'll leave it here if you want to show some slides. We definitely have time for some questions. We have one microphone in the aisle there. And another microphone here.
I have one here as well.
Yeah, and Michelle, thank you. Okay, do we have then questions from the audience? Well, yeah, PIP is closed, so that's very good.
Thanks, Christoph. That was indeed a wonderful talk, and great to hear it. I'm a great fan of your Swiss student life study. I used it in my former role. I just think you're looking at questions that policymakers do indeed need to know the answers to. And I was very intrigued by the bubble intervention, particularly around the management of the minority groups. Have you got to the point of actually looking to see whether that's had an impact on outcomes and networks for those minorities?
No, unfortunately not. We do have all these things pre-registered, but I must admit, I was feeling a bit bored just talking about old things. So I spent the last couple of days doing some preliminary analyses on these data. So we're in the middle of analyzing, but exactly those minority effects we have pre-registered. So questions about whether actually it makes a difference. I mean, we can compare majority groups because some of the majority members have exposure to minority members and others don't. And we can at least using this quasi-experimental design to learn whether this has an effect on well, cross-group ties. So that's definitely one of the things we want to look into. Sorry that I can't tell you more at this point.
So I think we were going to switch between online and in-person questions, if that's okay. Do we have one from online right now? Okay, we don't have one from online yet, so we'll go to another in-person. Yep. Do we have another in-person question? No, there's
Tom-
somebody monitoring it. Don't worry, they got it under
So,
control.
yeah, so is there a question from Tom Snyder's? That's the.
No,
classic.
sorry, he raised his hand and I said, you need to type. it
Oh,
out."
it's just by accident. I think you explained it all.
Excellent. Okay, then thank you very much. So,
Well, yeah, so, there you go. If you don't have the questions, now you, of course, you will find Christoph at the hospitality suite later on, where you can ask him anything you want to know.
You have a question.
We do have a question,
Yeah.
excellent. Is that
I have,
James?
Thanks, Christoph, for your talk. I'm super impressed by your student life data collection. I think it's incredible to get such a huge network data set over time. And I think there's a lot of people here who know how incredibly difficult it is to collect data on whole networks like that. Do you have any, what were your biggest lessons from collecting that data? You know, something you'd kind of give as advice to people when they're collecting network data?
I guess the by far smartest thing I did was that I was lucky that I could hire some people who had done it before. And Johan mentioned people like Jofi and Ondrash, who had been involved in big data collections. And I think that was just incredibly important to have people on the team who didn't do it for the first time. Because for me, it was the first time running a study like this, and I would have been completely lost without them and the other team members who were involved in the project. Well, there are many lessons learned. Some we discuss in the paper. So I think some things I would probably do somewhat differently. Some things worked well. So for example, we had a clear division of roles in the team. I remember when we planned the data collection, we were lucky to have Gary visiting us in Zurich. And I asked him, okay, what is the one thing I shouldn't forget about? And he said, okay, just make space for, let's say, adding 2-3 random questions that you think might be interesting at some point, even if you don't have a hypothesis about at that point. And we followed that advice, and that was certainly a good one. So I just pass on Gary's advice that we got back in the days.
Okay, it looks like we do have a question from online.
There's a question from Lorian. Do you think the size and/or temporal nature of your data opens new avenues for testing of SNA theories or theory building? And if so, what?
Sorry, I was trying to read the question as you were reading it, but I can't find it here. So, can you maybe say it again? Oh, that's it one. Oh, sorry.
I'll read it again.
Yes, I think so. Thank you for this question. I think, well, if you look into all those old social network theories, often they do not relate just to perceived networks, but they often relate to kind of an overlap between perceived networks, so how people see their social environment, how they perceive their friendship, trust, positive, negative relationships, but also about how people actually behave, so how they interact with others. And I feel that these two levels, like the perceived level, the cognitive level, this is something that we can probably best still collect through surveys, because this is what we're after, how people perceive the environment. But then there's this behavioral dimensions. And I think there are lots of opportunities how we can think about what people actually do, how they interact with others, whether they are in the same social setting, whether they attend the same social focus. In principle, these are data where we don't have to rely on people remembering, but where we could use some digital tools. I mean, obviously, digital platforms nowadays are important social foci where people meet. And I think there's many of the these old theories, they have a dimension of perception and they have a dimension of interaction. And I think if we are able to combine the two statistically, we can also kind of be more explicit about testing theoretical predictions. I attended this great talk of David Crackert this morning about balance. I think this is a great example because he already writes that in order for people to develop this stress that relates to being in imbalanced situations, one of the conditions is that you have to be actually in the same situation with people. I mean, it's not so stressful to have two friends who don't like each other if you never are in the same room with them. But there is this level of interaction of actually being in a situation, this behavioral side, that we can use to be more explicit about what we want to test and the theoretical predictions that we want to test.
Great, thank you. Do we have another, we have a in person? Do you want to go back and forth?
Go ahead. Okay.
Christoph, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you here in Cairns and with your usual rigor and scientific strengths all on display. My question is not really about your work, but it's a little bit out of left field. But one of the themes that is implicit in this conference is not the special theme, we know what that is, but there's been a deliberate attention to early career researchers and how to develop early career research and their careers, so to speak. And there have been sessions on that, and also the keynote speaker yesterday was asked about what advice to give. Now, usually people are asked for advice, you know, old geezers like me. I think it's much more relevant to ask someone like you who in the space of a decade or so have built such a successful social network lab.
So, may I just say, we don't have anyone coming in this room after this, but I would like to emphasize that there are posters. They are starting now. So please don't forget that. But I think that we can go on and take the questions started coming along now because we're all quite tired and haggard. But in Europe, they apparently just have woken up and they're very keen. So I'd like to read out this other question from Ninke.
Why don't we let him answer Gary's question though first, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. In due course.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid my answer is probably relatively short because I don't really have a good answer to that. Well, of course, maybe the older you get, and I think one condition to get this award is that you reach a reasonable age at some point. Maybe the more you kind of tend to translate what you did into the right thing to do. I'm not sure, but I guess there are many different paths how researchers can achieve what they want to do. I would actually be happy to hear your thoughts on that, Gary. I'll ask you later. Okay.
Great question, Gary. Now may I read out Nika's question? Okay, so Nika says, that's great work, Christoph, exclamation point. Thanks for your nice presentation. Could you tell a bit more about the model you plan to implement for co-evolution of network states and network events? How do you plan to model this? And what do you think would be a good, applications? You have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. No. Well, thanks, Ninke, also for the exclamation mark. So I think there are many possible applications because we have more and more opportunities to collect behavioral data, not just on social media, but also through social sensor tools. I'm not sure what the best applications would be. I think there are lots of interesting things that one could do. I think maybe referring back to the question of Lorian and what I said, I think there are many ways how we can test theoretical predictions in a more fine-grained way. And I mean, obviously, there's a lot of research using timestamp data nowadays, so like social media research, which somewhat seems a bit disconnected from let's say traditional social network research, where we have been, or people have been mostly working with data perception data. And I think it's probably very promising to try to bring those two back together. I'm not sure whether this already will be achieved by this one specific model, but maybe it's a small contribution to kind of closing a gap that has opened up a little bit.
So if nobody else in the audience has a question right this exact moment, I have one. Great. So I'm really interested in this idea of how we can isolate shocks onto how people change or form ties. So I know that a lot of the dynamic models that we're working with now are able to kind of explain to us how people are forming ties, or, you know, sort of in general, and we sort of relate those to social theories about how people form ties just in a general sense. These are things like homophily and transitivity, but how might those things be, like, how do we separate those general tendencies from things that people might be doing differently when they're facing a big shock, like a climate shock or COVID?
Yeah, great question. I don't know. I would have to speculate. I guess I have come across some research on networks at times of crisis, and it seems that when things get difficult, people tend to rely on their most important ties, on family ties, on well, maybe potentially networks shrink and focus on the strongest ties. I don't really know, but for sure I like the question of how we can explore this and how we can maybe use statistical tools to try to understand these questions. And of course, in principle, if we had data, let's say pre-shock, during shock, after shock, comparing the differences in dynamics, I think that would be incredibly interesting to do.
Have that data, so we should definitely talk.
Excellent.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to start wrapping this up, but there is one last question from online.
There's also another one on the Hoover chat, but we can ignore it.
Okay, well, we prioritize this one from Ali Al-Akbar, who says, thanks a lot for an amazing talk, Christoph. What if we have already gathered and observed network data, for example, social media data that is not designed for research? How could we link the micro to macro when the data is already gathered? Any suggestions? Question mark. Thanks. So these will, I think, be your closing remarks.
Well, thanks for the question. I'm not sure whether having collected the data already kind of would prevent you from thinking about network dynamics, also maybe micro level dynamics versus changes in macro level patterns. Maybe the question points a bit at the fact that I think traditionally we start with a research question and then do collect data and try to answer the initial question, whereas we have, of course, a lot of incidental data collection. So all of a sudden we have great data, huge data sources available, and people try to make sense of them. And I think in principle, either approach is fine. I mean, you can do more explorative research in an attempt to maybe develop some theoretical ideas in a domain that you know very little about. Versus kind of starting with a theoretical idea and then collect data in a specific setting. So I think either approach is fine in general, as long as people are very transparent which of the two they took. Thanks for the question, Ali.
Yeah, great. And thank you for your answers and for your lovely talk, Christoph. I honestly thought it was great. So let's give Christoph another round of applause. And please keep this discussion going. It's easy to reach out to Christoph on Hoover. which is good. And we have lots of communities going there. So do that or reach out to him tonight physically in an appropriate manner. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. It was a very good.
It's a very nice introduction. I just remember that it was Kyla in the back,
Yeah.
and she told me later about her